joining us this morning in this very cosy room, but it will make, I think, for less of a question time style discussion and more of a conversation, which is, I think, what we want to achieve. I will just start by saying a bit about what the Coalition for Global Prosperity does, just for a second or two, and then I will introduce each of our fantastic speakers in turn, who will offer some opening remarks, and then we will get stuck into that conversation, which I mentioned a moment ago. So the Coalition for Global Prosperity, for those of you who don't know us, exists to champion the UK as an international development superpower. And we believe that an active development strategy working alongside diplomacy and defence keeps Britain at the forefront of saving lives, alleviating poverty, and bringing freedom, security and prosperity, not just to us in the UK, but to those around the world who need it most. And I'm delighted to be joined by Lesia Vasilenko from Ukraine, who's a Member of Parliament in Ukraine, Darren Cormack, who's the CEO of the Mines Advisory Group, Flick Drummond and Joe Gideon, both Members of Parliament here in the UK. So, without any further ado, can I ask Darren to come to the podium and offer some opening remarks first of all?
Great. I'm sure you can see me quite easily enough from there as well, but for the photos apparently as well. Well, thank you all for getting here and just joining us and being part of this conversation. I do hope it can be, we can benefit from the size of the room and have, as Ryan says, a discussion. But yeah, as Ryan says, so my name is Darren Cormack. I'm the CEO of MAG, the Mines Advisory Group, and we work in around 33 countries around the world. Essentially doing three things. One is kind of trying to prevent conflict through helping states to manage their small arms and light weapons, illicit weapons, to prevent the leakage of guns into fragile and conflict-affected states. The second thing we do is we kind of deal with conflict response. We work in contexts that are in conflict, such as we're seeing and we'll obviously discuss in Ukraine today, but at other places around the world, particularly Syria over the last few years where we've been working extensively. And then we also deal with the legacy of conflict, which will also be a major factor to Ukraine's reconstruction over the long term, and dealing with that legacy of mines and UXO. For 30 years, we've witnessed the sort of untold suffering that the legacy of conflict has on communities who are growing up as a generation that never experienced war, but dealt with the impediment, the legacy of war. And again, that'll be a generation, sadly, in Ukraine that suffers from a war that its kind of forefathers fought. And that's something that we also need to bear in mind as we look at the long-term needs of a response that are required. Because, without peace and safety, prosperity can't happen. You can't walk. So if you can't walk safely, if you can't go to school safely, then people don't prosper. And I think that human rights issue is something that is central to the conversation and the work here that we're doing. And obviously, there's a very macro issue about the undermining of IHL, which includes the use of weapons in certain contexts and conflicts. That is probably part of the conversation today. But it's also seeing in the global sense how the undermining of IHL is also destabilising, contexts around the world. And these things are interconnected in very complicated ways, so I don't necessarily want to get too drawn into that. But, we've got a team currently hibernating in Burkina Faso the last couple of days as a result of a coup there. And no doubt some of the sentiments of the coup there are emboldened as a result of kind of a sense of impunity, really, in the upholding of IHL. And I think these are kind of factors that are very relevant to the context. But specifically in respect to what MAG does, working with communities at risk of conflict, I left Ukraine about 10 days ago, and saw firsthand the deadly effect, really, that we are seeing as a result of the invasion, the attempted invasion and taking of Kyiv, where, the use of mines, unexploded ordnance, the use of relentless artillery in that context has had a deadly effect on people. The scale of the problem, is enormous, and essentially when it talks about areas that are at risk of being mined, the statistics from anywhere of 70 to 160,000 kilometres squared could be at risk of landmines. Now, they're big numbers. That's 2/3 the size of the entire UK, could be suspected as hazardous. Now, good survey is needed to better understand that problem, but the sense of fear is also a risk. If you daren't use assets, if you daren't walk to school, if you daren't walk across a field, if you daren't plough your field, it's as good as being contaminated anyway. So understanding the problem is an enormous responsibility that we have as an organisation like MAG, working with friends and colleagues such as the Halo Trust, working with government agencies in Ukraine. These are major priorities, both understanding the extent of the problem, but also responding to the immediate needs, particularly in liberated areas. Just finally, I mean, one particular aspect which might be worth drawing out in this conversation today is also the issue of use of explosive weapons in populated areas. The world is urbanising, conflict is urbanising. We've seen that in Raqqa, where we've been working for many years. The context devastated. I can't imagine what cities like Homs continue to feel like to live in, and now cities like Kharkiv. And the reality is that when explosive weapons are used in populated areas, 9 out of 10 people killed or injured are civilians, and that is a deadly effect. I was in a place called Irpin, which is close to Bucha, which you probably have heard about the atrocities of Bucha from the start of the conflict. I was there 10 days ago, and I was stood at the end of a street. One house had been hit by an artillery shell. That ignited a fire, and the density of that urban environment creates a catalytic effect, and the entire street was burnt out. And people can't return because of that, the use of indiscriminate shelling in urban areas. Now, thankfully, the UK government is committed currently to Ukraine, and we're dealing with a long-term problem with short-term funding cycles. So, part of the discussion is also how do we deal with long-term challenges, both within mine action, but obviously in the broader aid sector, and how do we stand with Ukraine once the headlines of Ukraine have dropped away and other contexts become sadly also at the forefront. So the needs of Ukraine are enormous, but as Lesia, a friend who I've met in Kiev and had the pleasure of working with this week, the will, the determination of the people of Ukraine. I know it sounds a bit cliched, but when you see it, when you feel it, I mean, there is a sense of only one outcome is possible, and kind of applaud that, and hopefully conversations today really just stimulate ourselves as part of that, to be supporters of that journey as well. So that was a bit more than 2 minutes, but hopefully food for thought. Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you very much. Joe, could I ask you to go on the phone next? Thank you.
There's some wires there just to...
Thank you. When I was asked to contribute today, I was a little nervous because I said my knowledge of Ukraine isn't great, but I was enormously privileged to have been able to visit Lebanon thanks to the Coalition for Global Prosperity and MAG. And so my first-hand experience of the impact of the devastation of a country, of landscapes across a country because of I suppose the remnants of war, but multiple wars, and to the scale that I saw really brought it home to me as a parliamentarian how utterly important this work is. And so I wanted to speak out really in support of the work and in support of the long-term funding of work like this. So I went to Lebanon in 1975, and I remember it as a country that was beautiful, fruitful throughout. It was, I mean, they used to describe it as a sort of Monte Carlo of the Middle East. And what I saw was a country that was unable to kind of provide food for its people, and it was quite strange that the link to Ukraine was very evident in that the first ship of wheat that went out from Ukraine was to Lebanon, wasn't it? I know, Ukraine was described as the breadbasket of the world. If that ceases to happen, then the long-term devastating effect, both to the rest of the world and also to Ukraine, is really difficult to think about. I mean, in terms of what it means to live in a country that is covered in landmines and the remnants of cluster bombs, I didn't quite expect when I went on the visit that when we went to the minefields, you sign in, and you also have to put your blood type down before you actually go onto the minefield. To me, that was a kind of wake-up call that this is what people are going through every day, the people who clear the mines, but also, as was said, the farmers that have to look as to whether their land is safe or not. And I think clearly in Ukraine, all that work is, still needs to be done. I think as a sort of lay person, you kind of think that war's over when, the troops recede and peace of a superficial nature comes back, but clearly it isn't. And there is nothing more important than food security for a country. And so without the ability to farm the land, and if agriculture being such a hugely important element of the Ukraine economy, it has devastating effects. So, I mean, that was really all I wanted to contribute, to say it is such important work. The difficulty is obviously for any government making choices, because, as you quite rightly pointed out, this situation is the case in countries throughout the world, and governments have budgets, and there are always choices to be made. We've got a huge commitment to Ukraine, and I hope that will continue hopefully it won't be 40 years, but if it is 40 years, then that's the commitment that you need to hear from us. And I also hope that at a sort of legislative place in an international space, that we manage to do something about stopping this sort of terrible activity happening in the future. We all hope for a better world, but this is akin. And in the meantime, organisations like MAG are essential, and the work that you do is so very important.
Oops. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I'll be very quick, because actually we don't want to hear from UK MPs, we want to hear from Ukrainian MP, really. So I was on the Royal College Defence Studies course, not last year, the year before, and we had some Ukrainians on the course, and we then get updates from them every day. One of them's in Odessa. And it's really brought home to me, because every day we get these statistics. So I just want to give some of them to you. It's the Ukrainian Centre for Defence Studies sends them in. And particularly I'm concerned about is children. And they're saying, 1,200 Ukrainian children are victims of full-scale armed aggression. And so far, as from the ones that they've actually recorded, and of course you can't, statistics are very difficult to record in the hostile environments where the Russians are occupying at the moment, but 416 children have died, 84 wounded, and 2,562 education institutions have been damaged, with 295 completely destroyed. This is a huge humanitarian crisis, which is going to take a long time to fix, with 4.6 million people internally displaced. Not to say how many have come over across the borders as well. I don't actually have the statistics on that, but I'm sure we may hear that. So there is not only mine clearing, which I'm really grateful that MAG are coordinating, but there's going to be a massive sort of Marshall Plan. The damage, it already exceeds the Ukrainian GDP by 1.6 times. So that's, without a lot of help from the UK, the US and the EU, Ukraine is going to spend a long time recovering. This year the GDP is estimated to go down by 30%. But already the recovery is starting to be put into place. And it shouldn't, let's hope that we can do it faster than it looks like when you see the desperate pictures for the buildings. The last thing I just want to say to talk about is that they've done a research. The Centre for Socioeconomic Research in Ukraine has said, what would be the biggest disappointment for you after the end of the war? And most Ukrainian residents answered Russia's impunity for crimes committed. How are we going to track down all those Russian atrocities, the people that have caused it? The second and third places were taken up by high level of corruption, 36.3%. I suspect that's more to do with the Ukrainian government, and low standards of living and poverty, 34%. So that really ties in with the economic consequences of this terrible war. And the last thing I just want to point out is that they also give us statistics on how many Russians have died in the war. And this is not totally accurate, but they reckon 60,800 Russians have died. So young men have died in that. That's almost the size of the British Army. That's on Putin's hands, that is, really. He's caused the destruction of an army, and we've seen that now they're obviously conscripting. But the scale of this horrendous humanitarian crisis, in just so close to us as well, is unmanageable. And we will do, the UK government will be doing whatever we can to support the Ukraine government over the next few years and beyond, as Joe said, could be a very long time. So that's, I'm not going to say any more because I'm really more interested in talking and hearing from a Ukrainian MP. Thank you.
Lesia, I had the privilege of hearing you speak last night, and as a result, I thought it would be unfair on the other panellists for them to follow you. So thank you for being patient, and thank you so much for being here. We're really grateful, and we'd love to invite you to come and speak.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and actually thank you to all the other panelists. I'm very, very impressed at your knowledge of Ukraine. You're being very modest when you're saying that you don't know so much about Ukraine and that you have limited knowledge. No, you have a pretty accurate sense of what is going on in Ukraine. I'm Lesia Vaslenko, as it says in your bios, and I'm not sure it says that, but I am a member of the Environmental Committee, and in my parliament I chair the subcommittee on climate change. But I think, given the name Coalition for Global Prosperity, under normal circumstances, I would be sharing what Ukraine could do to contribute to global prosperity and tackling the big challenge up ahead in front of all of us, the climate change challenge. And I'm a champion of that in the Ukrainian parliament. But for the last 7 months, I have put that hat on hold and put it away in the wardrobe somewhere, because for the last 7 months every single Ukrainian MP has been doing their best, as every single Ukrainian citizen, to keep the country safe and to keep the country existing physically. For the last 7 months I have used every opportunity, every platform like this one here, which you have so generously provided, to speak the testimony of Ukraine and of Ukrainians, and give not just the numbers but also a feel, what it feels like to be Ukrainian right now, and what it feels like to be fighting for the right, well, to actually exist, not even to live yet, but just to exist. Darren has spoken very accurately on the numbers. I can confirm those, because actually under the Environmental Committee in the Parliament of Ukraine, we are also sort of covering the state emergency services. The national emergency services, they come to our committee to report to Parliament from the government side, and their statistics is that over half of the territory of Ukraine may be covered in landmines. That is 300,000 square kilometers of land. They also report on the casualties, on the civilian casualties that every day are suffering, well, from direct contact with landmines or other remnants of weapons, of explosive weapons. Darren has given you the statistics, and I will tell you how it feels. So he mentioned Irpin and Bucha. These are small towns just 20-30 kilometers from Kiev. And these towns, they are very urbanistic. They are very kind of where middle-class families, young professionals would live, because they can't afford to live in Kiev downtown. But because this is so close, it's a very convenient drive, just straight up the road, and you're basically in Kiev. Families would choose to live there. Young families would choose to live there because it's a nicer environment. It was a nicer environment. These days, although these towns have rebuilt, it's nothing like you saw on the 2nd and 3rd of April, when the cities were liberated and when you came in and there were literally body parts lying down in the streets, and people were coming out from basements absolutely hungry because they haven't had a hot meal in 30 days. Now it's nothing like that. Now it's over the summer there was a lot of greenery. They started rebuilding these towns and cities. But people, these young families with young kids, they cannot go into the woods, they cannot go into the parklands because it's a hazard. It's a hazard, and warnings are being issued by local authorities and state emergency services on a daily basis, sometimes on an hourly basis, reminding that no, you do not go into the woods. The very reason why you move to these areas, you don't go there just because the territory is so heavily mined and so heavily covered in explosives. And for example, the godfather of one of my children, his family lives there in Irpin. They're originally from there. They have a vast network of friends, and for them, their main weekend activity would actually be going into these woods, especially now that autumn is there, and to do mushroom picking. And they don't have that luxury, and from among their friends, actually, there was a casualty. Someone who decided that he knows best, that he will go around walking, and this person has now lost several digits on his hand, and I think that is actually very, very lucky for him. And these are the situations a bit all over Ukraine, and the victims, the main victims of these circumstances, they are the children, because you can repeat to a child an X amount of times, don't go there, don't do that, but they still will because it's natural curiosity. And for children to have a contact with an explosive, with a landmine, or any other explosive weapons, well, that's not going to be having a couple of digits blown off. That's going to be a life lost. And unfortunately, we have casualties like that in Ukraine as well. The other major area of concern is actually the marine areas that have been mined as well. For protection, Ukraine has mined all along the coastline, and we didn't have any other choice. And we realized that by doing so, we have created a problem which we will be needing to solve. Ukraine relies on its own marine ports to export the grain. And you are right, Ukraine is a breadbasket not just of Europe but of the world. Ukraine feeds 400 million people in Africa alone. We export 58 million tons of grain a year from our seaports alone. Unfortunately, that's a no-go at the moment because all along the coastline, it's mined for protection. The first line is mined for protection by Ukrainian authorities, and then the second line is mined by Russian for attacking purposes. So there's going to be a lot of demining to be done there. In terms of how long it will take, well, it will take as long as needed. First of all, to have the victory for Ukraine. Because Ukrainians, we will be fighting for as long as we have to until the very last Russian soldier leaves our land. We have no other choice, we have no other option, we have no other Ukraine. This is as things stand. This is why you have been witnessing this courage and this resilience that so many people speak about. Well, I have no doubt that the British people would have done the same if it was about their land, and the British people did do the same on so many occasions in history. I mean, we are in Birmingham now, which was heavily bombed during the Second World War. Just 20 kilometers from here is Coventry, which was razed to the ground pretty much, like several cities in East Ukraine have been razed to the ground. But the people have shown resilience, and the people have stood up to the aggressor. And I think in this way we are similar with the British people, and this is why we find so much support exactly coming from the UK and coming from British leadership, also coming from British households for Ukrainians. I can just say that I hope that the victory for Ukraine will come quickly, and we need this victory, and by we I mean the British and the French and the Americans and all the free world countries. They need this victory to come quickly. We cannot stand for years countering aggression time and time again. We need to put an end to aggression once and for all. But that victory doesn't doesn't stop with just the Ukrainians kicking out the Russians from our own territory. That victory has a formula which follows, and that formula is based on the non-repetition guarantee. And the non-repetition guarantee in itself is based on having clear definitions that all the perpetrators are punished for all the crimes. That means the soldiers that were committing the war crimes, that means the generals that were commanding them, and that means the Kremlin establishment that has been leading on all of this. But also we need reparations, because it is with great thanks that we meet every single initiative coming from every single government, including the British, saying that we will support you for as long as it takes to get rid of the Russians, but then to also rebuild. And thank you, friends, for that. But it is not you who have caused this damage in Ukraine in the first place. It is the Russians, and it is they who should pay. And my firm belief is that they shouldn't just pay for what they have done to Ukraine, but they should also pay back, again, the British public for the investment that they have been putting into global defense and security by helping Ukraine. And I believe that with united efforts, we can make all of this happen, make this formula for long-standing peace and prosperity a reality. It's just a matter of sticking strong, sticking together. Unfortunately, again, we do not have another option, and by we here, I mean not just the Ukrainians, but the British as well, because anything else, any other kind of formula of peace will mean that there will be an again, and will mean that the phrase never again, which so many of us cherish and have great respect for, well, really, under the circumstances of today, it has lost its meaning, and it will continue losing that meaning until we put an end to aggression and make sure that it never repeats again. And once we're done that, we can go back to discussing the future for global prosperity, the strategic challenges ahead of us, and we can be putting our heads back together and thinking how every single nation, Ukraine included, can contribute to a long-lasting prosperity for every single nation in the world. Thank you.
Great. Well, I said it would be hopefully a conversation or a discussion. So before I dive into my questions, has anyone got anything they would like to ask our panel, first of all? Yes, please, sir.
Thank you very much, Julian. I'm an Ealing counsellor. We've hosted a lot of Ukrainian families in Ealing, which I've seen very successfully as well. This is a question actually about Crimea. Obviously, Crimea was part of Ukraine as guaranteed by the three guarantee powers in 1991. And it was part of Ukraine, and therefore it is very much part of Ukraine. It's very much part of the your plan to take it back. Question: has there been any mining of Crimea? Has it been mined itself? Is the same energy to take it back as there is to take back the eastern provinces? Is there the same energy to do that?
Well, first of all, thank you for hosting the Ukrainian families. My family is also in the UK, so I know what it's like for the hosts and for the hosties, and it's a huge impact and input in Ukraine's victory. Have no doubt about that. Your question about Crimea, well, of course, Crimea is part of Ukraine, and of course we have the same wish and willingness and energy to take it back, the same as with all the other territories. There can be no long-lasting peace, and there can be no victory without Crimea coming back as Ukraine under the Ukrainian flag. Has it been mined? Yes, it has. Let me put it this way. I cannot say any more details for reason of security from the Ukrainian side, from the Russian side. I will presume it is mined, but I will not know the details.
I mean, other than to say, really, to just verify what Les is saying, I mean, of the numbers we were quoting, 160,000 kilometres squared, or the 300,000, 350 that the Ministry of the Environment is covering, that includes Crimea, so it is considered in that suspect contamination as well, just to answer your question.
Anyone else before I dive into mine? Look, my first... Yes. Please, yeah.
Steve Sankey, I'm a counsellor. Actually, I've got a Ukrainian family in my house, and they're lovely. They're part of the family. My question is slightly more political. Given the change in administration now, with Lord Harrington now resigning on the 4th of September, have we still got still the strength of representation in government for this? Because there is a strong passion to support the Ukrainian people around the country, and we do need it. So have we got that? And also, are we trying to make sure that we get more consistency across the country on supporting the Ukrainian people around? Because it is not consistent across the country, and it really needs to be, to help all these people.
Well, yeah, I mean, there will be a new minister appointed. I'm not quite sure who it is at the moment in the Home Office, but there's definitely, we've fully committed, as the Prime Minister has already said, to helping every single Ukrainian. As far as the, around the country, of course the local authorities are the ones that are running what's happening in each authority. So it would be up to councillors like yourself to put the policy into place. But the money should be coming through. And if it's not, then you need to...
It's not necessarily the money, it's the guidance to make sure that there's consistency across where you're living. And there's so many differences around the country that some of the people feel that they're being disadvantaged compared to other Ukrainian people 100 yards, 200 yards away in a different part of the country. It is unfair. We should be supporting them fairly across the country.
No, the only thing
I've got to have to pick it up separate afterwards. So
from speaking to Ukrainians in my house, there's a difference between the family scheme and the other scheme. And so yes, and so depending on how the Ukrainians came,
it's not the scheme. I'm happy to pick it up.
We're happy to take this up with the ministers.
I think it's an important point though, and Joe, you mentioned being out in Lebanon with us earlier this year. I'd be interested in the panel's thoughts on the extent to which the UK's aid commitment to places like Ukraine, but also Lebanon and other places, helps not just the recipients at the other end, but serves the UK's interests too. And can I kick off with you, Joe?
Yeah, so what was very striking in Lebanon, and deeply upsetting, I have to say, is the pessimism and the complete lack of hope of everybody I met, from the young children, should we say the children, to politicians. There seemed to be a sense of that there was no hope for the country, nothing was going to change, and businesses. So we visited the port. Remember the huge explosion that they had, and that sense of hopelessness of a whole nation was quite frankly, deeply disturbing. And I couldn't, but I could understand it, because the sheer scale of the problem, I guess, was something that that people felt very deep. Lebanon has a slightly different backdrop of well over a third of the population, almost half the population having refugee status, and because of that, there's that kind of inherent instability of them not being integrated into the country. But the key thing is, and this is why I went back to the breadbasket and the food element, and in a sense, through the war in Ukraine and the kind of insecurity of food security in this country, we've seen exactly the same issue, that people, at the point at which they think that they go to the supermarket, the shelves are empty, that becomes a reality for everybody, and it's very sort of an existential threat. So and that was the sense that I had in Lebanon, that there was a kind of fundamental existential threat, and obviously the mining of the country and the fact that they couldn't look after themselves was kind of fundamental to the psyche. And I think probably in Ukraine it might well be the same if the aftermath is, you say it's not just the mining of the port, so you can't get the wheat out, but you won't be able to grow it if the entire agricultural land is covered in mines.
Well, can I just comment on that in terms of agricultural land? In terms of providing Ukraine's own food security, we are actually doing okay, and more than okay. Ukraine is an agricultural country, meaning that we are actually exporting most of what we grow. So 65% of our agricultural produce gets exported. We send it out abroad. We only need for our internal consumption maybe 35%, maybe 30% of what we actually grow. We, even with the land contamination now, we are still able to farm the land and to make good use of it. I mean, we had these when it started, the harvest season has started, and it was time to sow the fields again and plow the fields. The miners would be actually fighting by day, and then they would be, sowing their fields by night, which is for the farmers, it's something heroic. You already had the pictures with the tractors pulling out the tanks, and now it came to a new level of heroism. So in terms of internal security, we're good. It's actually the international food security which is at stake. And I did mention the African countries, and you are right that for Lebanon, I mean, this is just crucial. It's existential. And then you have to realize that the countries not getting who are reliant on Ukrainian grain exports or imports for them. They will start having problems such as famine come back. And when famine comes back, that means a migration crisis around Africa, but also in Europe. And that means a whole new level of economic problems that shouldn't be in the world at this stage of the development of our civilization, technology, and so on and so forth. With that being said, it's not just Africa or Asian countries and continents suffering. It's also Europe. I mean, turns out that Ukraine was exporting corn to feed Italian cattle, Italian cows. So the dairy products in Italy have gone up in price. The hop that German beer is brewed on is also coming from Ukraine. They have a beer crisis in Germany because of what's going on. And so things like that. Actually, fish and chips oil, sunflower, there was a crisis here. That's also coming from Ukraine. That's also, Russia is also the cause of why you can't have your fish and chips.
Title for a speech. The ingredients are revolutionary.
No beer, no fish and chips. Flick, is there a growing understanding, do you think, among your constituents and others in the country that there's always tough decisions to be made about what the UK spends, particularly overseas when there's challenges at home. But do you think, given everything that's happened in Ukraine and is happening, that there's a growing understanding from the public that what happens overseas affects us too? Or do you think that case still needs to be made?
Well, I hope so. I mean, I was an opponent of reducing it from 0.7 to 0.5, and I don't know what the new government actually views on that. Actually, I hope they're going to put it up, because Rishi, when he was Chancellor, said it would go back. It is absolutely essential. I mean, I was brought up in developing countries, and so I've seen at first hand the poverty and the desperation of people. And unless, as Alicia said, this is a civilized world, and we shouldn't be allowing people to be starving in this day and age. And the more we can build up other countries, the less impact it's going to have on us, particularly with migration, as you said. Although, of course, now we do need some migration in the UK because we're very short of people. But it's so important that, and the things go back to things like nurses and doctors. They come over here to be trained, and then they don't go back again. So they've got a big shortage of overseas. So we've got there's so much capacity that the West should be putting in to developing countries to ensure that they come up to the same level of standard, well, whatever standard they want to come up to. And of course, with digital technology and the use of the internet, they can all see what it's like in other countries. Anyone who's been to India knows that you can't get cheap goods anymore because they know exactly how much it costs because they've got it on their phone, and so that sort of spread of technology has meant that other people are very much aware about how other people live, and they want to live like that too, and why not? So it is really important. I think it's one of our biggest security things, is to make sure that other countries are securing themselves.
So I think beer and fish and chips is the way that we get the message across, because clearly those are things that impact people's everyday lives. But I think there's also a bigger piece around food security that we need to look, each country needs to look what it produces. And I think that domestic production for the domestic market is something that I think every country will now be looking at. If you know that the supply chain importing food isn't great, and I think that applies to every country that's been impacted by this, but also more generally, and when we're talking about global prosperity and climate change, it's much better for people to be producing closer to home if they can.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone have any questions for I plough on? Otherwise, Leslie, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. Given the energy crisis that's facing Europe and us in the UK, is there a risk as we sort of the months go on that the international community puts pressure on Ukraine to accept some form of forced compromise? Do you worry about that? And is that something that you and your colleagues are thinking about?
Well, I'm actually confident in the international community being well aware that we've tried already the compromises with Putin. That is 2015, when the so-called Minsk agreements were being, signed is the wrong word, when Ukraine was being pushed into the so-called Minsk agreements, and then Ukraine was actually adhering to the political side, but Russia wasn't adhering to one single letter of it. So we've tried going down that road. We've tried having Crimea being annexed and sort of everyone looking the other way and being okay with it. We've tried with the parts of Donetsk and Luhansk regions living under occupation for 8 years. We've been down that road. That road led us to the 24th of February of this year and 7 months of living in right down hell, in an all-out war in the middle of Europe and in the middle of the 21st century. That way has led us to being sitting here and having to discuss existential matters and how to survive and how to win an existential war, rather than discussing how we can employ and use digital technology innovation to bring more equality and fairness and prosperity to the world on a global level. So I'm pretty confident in the leaders of today's world and in their awareness and in their knowledge, their short-term knowledge of history, which was happening just a little less than 8 years ago. Your question has the second part of it, and that is the tiring out of Ukraine, the Ukraine fatigue. And we've experienced that back in 2015, 2016 as well. We know in Ukraine what it feels like. But I cannot put the blame on anyone for that, and nobody should be blamed. We are all human, we have all a brain, our brain functions and has allowed us to exist as human beings for so long in history because it adapts, and our psyche adapts to situations no matter how difficult, how challenging, how impossible they are. And this is exactly what our brain is doing. So I think that here I can only ask that all of us do our bit and we approach the situation with full awareness, and we talk to our brain every morning and sort of remind it that this is not the new normal, this is not normal. And I do this every day as a Ukrainian, especially when I'm in Ukraine. And I'm sitting having lunch or a work meeting and there's suddenly an air raid alarm sounding, and I just sort of go on as if nothing was happening and it's the normal, and I'm like, no, this is not normal, brain, this is not normal, please do not get used to it. But unfortunately this is the sad truth. In Ukraine we have gotten used to the sounds of war being part of our new normal. We have gotten used to the news of the casualties of war being the new normal. We have gotten used to going to funerals almost every single weekend as the new normal because somebody whom we know, somebody whom someone from our loved ones or family knows has died because of the war. This is not normal, and we need to do our best to be reminding ourselves that this is not the new normal, and to be reminding the world. Thank God for technology, social media, Twitter, Facebook, anytime you can go and speak to the media if you're in public office and reminding that like the war is still going on, victory is still not there yet. Let's keep talking about Ukraine.
If Ukraine hadn't fought back, it would have been Estonia, Lithuania, and he would have just carried on. So I think you're doing, what you're doing now is saving all of us, really. Let's hope it carries on.
Well, actually, thank you for giving credit to the Baltics, because the Baltics are Ukraine's strongest allies. I mean, they may not be as strong economically or militarily as the UK is, for example, and they are much smaller and their resources are limited, but they have been there by Ukraine's side from day one back in 2014, and they were the ones ringing the alarm bells all over the place, in the UN, in the Council of Europe, in all the different kinds of structures that are out there, and saying, look, Russia is the danger here, Russia is the aggressor here, and they've been doing that even before Putin attacked, but they were always considered as the crazy man of Europe. So actually a lot of credit goes to the Baltics, because they did their bit, although we may not recognize it and see it as that, because they are just so much smaller than all the other nations.
Alice.
Speaking of the Baltics, and like you said earlier about it's not being a repeatable thing, what more can be done? Because obviously geopolitically Russia will always be where it is and will always feel, regardless of who's in charge, a form of aggression in some direction. Moving forward, what can we do as Britain and allies do to reduce the impact of that, so that there's not another Baltic state that finds himself in this situation in 10, 20, 30 years' time?
Is that to me? Okay. I think we should all have a go at this one, because it's an interesting one. Okay, but I'll start. So my biggest fear is that actually we are we are at the beginning of the 21st century in a way, and my biggest fear is that the 20th century is repeating itself. So there was First World War, then there was a kind of victory for the Allies, but that only spurred more remorse and sort of hatred among the Germans, got them united around that, and that started World War II. So that's my biggest fear, that this is the first bit, and there will be a kind of quiet time celebrating victory, but that victory will not be long lasting, and that victory will not be about the never again. There will be another war coming on. So I think that, again, turning to history, learning our lessons, we need to do our best to make sure that this is actually the only war of this scale in the 21st century. Now, how we do this, again, I believe in uniting efforts. I believe in solidarity of the democratic world, of the leaders of the free world. Sort of like there is a military Rammstein at the moment, I would like there to see there being an international responsibility for Russia Rammstein, where all the foreign secretaries, the ministers of justice, ministers of economy sit down and pull up a plan of sanctions if Russia escalates, but also a system of de-escalating in sanctions if Russia de-escalates. And for that, the system must go on not just until Russians leave Ukrainian soil, but also until the rebuilding process is finalized. Reparations, I'm a firm believer in reparations. If you've done wrong, you have to do the repairs, and it is Russia who needs to do the repairs. And it's up to all of us to think how we make them do this, because this is so key in having the Russians themselves understand and be in full awareness that their government and then they themselves have done the wrong. Again, a fine line here, not to create the same kind of situation where there will be just bitterness and remorse at these reparations. So they need to be, payable. They need to be doable. I would like to see a peace agreement eventually signed with provisions on demilitarization of Russia. We cannot be safe with Russia's military sector thriving and developing. Not one single country in this world can be safe. They need to learn their lessons. They need to understand that no, they cannot have their military sector intact because they used it to attack another country. Again, up to a united effort to make sure that happens. A nuclear-free Russia would probably be ideal. again, it will all depend on the circumstances of how the peace agreement is being signed with Russia, because all of that will need to go into that peace agreement. I mean, Ukraine has zero ambition to march on Moscow or any other Russian city. We don't need that. We don't want that. We have quite a large territory with a quite large Ukrainian population on our hands as is. We are good with what we have. We don't want anything that is somebody else's. But I think that Putin's Russia losing is actually going to be a victory for the Russian people, and it's going to be a victory for the freedom of the Russian people. And again, it is in the capacity of the leaders of the free world, of the democratic states, to push on and to make sure that happens, because that is also the guarantee of a never again.
I think just perhaps picking up on the question from a different perspective as well, in terms of what is the effect of, on other sovereign states, people's positions. You take a kind of more global perspective on the issue. You look at how security, UN security resolution voting went really, and the percentage of the global population that is represented by states that abstained is roughly 50%. You look at how a combination of factors in, say, somewhere like the Sahel, which, this war feels closer, but the instability in that region isn't far from Europe's doorstep, and, we're seeing the kind of underlying effects, really, of the influence of Russian forces in that region. You add into that the flooding of weapons as a result of the looting of Gaddafi's arsenal, into a region with porous borders. You've got, really a set of ingredients, to keep going with the analogy, really there, which are being baked and manifest over the weekend in a Russian-leaning, military junta now being installed in Burkina Faso, which, until recently, Burkina Faso means peaceful man, roughly translates that. That was an island of calm and a sea of instability. Now into that vacuum of poor governance, people speak, Russia influences, and now we've got a new set of challenges that are connected by an emboldened Russian intervention, if you see it from that perspective. What's that mean for the West? To bring back to the conversation then about Britain's force for good, that is a vacuum that UK aid should be, in, to help demonstrate really that there is a different way. You don't have to just lean on Russia, on China's investment for prosperity, but actually there are other means of prosperity and other alliances really that ultimately are more sustainable and probably would leave you economically less leveraged to people you don't want to ultimately be leveraged to. So I think there's another few ingredients really that we need to keep an eye on, and I think that the needs of people in Ukraine we have to stand with. But there's a global community as well that the aid must speak to, that is connected and dependent on Ukraine, but influenced by this conflict as well.
So I think we've taken democracy for granted for too long, and I was at a meeting earlier in the year with German politicians, and it was a sort of open agenda, bilateral talks, and we talked, I think, almost exclusively about Ukraine, Russia, China, and the future of democracy. And as you rightly said, going back a year or so, we would have been talking about global warming, we would have been talking about issues that, global prosperity. I think that there's a wide recognition now that Western democracies and those countries that value democracy have kind of assumed that people would know that it's the best form of government and governance, and therefore we haven't kind of pushed the agenda of selling it, if you like, to huge areas of the world that are now currently dependent upon Russia or China, because they've been, large parts of Africa have been financed through various schemes. And when we back away from the investment in international aid, somebody comes to fill the gap, and their intentions are not as benign as our intentions. So I think that it is a big problem. I think that it's good that it's being recognised. I think it will take a while to address. And it was pointed out that both Russia and China had sort of seen the gap in the market for having a voice on sort of international organisations, and so we've got some serious catching up to do. I just hope for the sake of future peace in the world that we are able to do so. That sounded very pessimistic to me.
It was really interesting. In the first thing in our CDS course, the Royal College Defence Studies course, you have to write an essay on the two greatest threats before 2030. I think the majority of us wrote China, and we didn't put Russia. And then later on, we had a lecture from Mark Sedwell, who banged on and on and on about Russia. And at the end I said, but we've all said that China's going to be the biggest threat, and you're talking about Russia. And he said, well, Russia is an acute threat. And that was the first time when everyone started to think, Russia. Well, I mean, I did. I suspect some of my other colleagues had already thought about it. But it's, we've been trying to appease Putin for a long time, and it hasn't worked. So we've got to work out a way, how do we help Russia build its civil society and change its nature? Now, I mean, there's two books, The Prisoner of Geography, I don't know if you've read that, and the other one. It just tells that the populations and why they behave in such a way they do. So what do we do? I mean, it's almost an impossible situation, isn't it? I mean, personally, I'd like to remove Russia from the Security Council and really condemn them that way. Whether we work with China and other allies, other autocratic societies, and try and get them, because I think China and India have started to put more pressure on Russia too. There's, and then going back to China is influencing very much through economics around the world, and Russia is very much on the militarily one, with the Wagner group going in and sort of helping other autocrats gain power. So can we do something on that? And if we've just if Ukraine has not quite decimated the Russian army, but is pretty much on the way and doing very well on that, is that going to what impact is that going to have? But I mean, until Putin goes, but then who's he going to be replaced with? I think this is going to be a massive threat for some time until we work out what we're going to do. I mean, I don't have the solution, but I'm hoping that someone will do. But whether we build, civil society and whether we can help do that, but we've tried, So, and the reparations thing, you're absolutely right. I'm glad you qualified it, because we saw what happened to Germany after the First World War, and then we had the Second World War, and if the reparations are too drastic, then, we do get bitterness.
They backfire.
They backfire, and then we don't get any civil society either, because they're on the other side, so... I would love to get the solution. I really would, because I think it's looking really bleak. I agree with Joe. I think it's really dire at the moment. Has anyone else got any ideas? Please.
Maybe that's a good point. Darren, we've spoken about the geopolitical side of things, but on a more tactical level, I suppose, for want of a better word, what more can the UK be doing to protect civilians in conflict?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really interesting, Ukraine and the response to the international community have done a lot to demonstrate the dependencies, the proximity that conflict now can have to ourselves. And one of the aspects I say is this urbanisation of warfare, which has characterised the conflict obviously in Ukraine, but in many other contexts. And currently there is a sort of political process underway around the prevention of explosive weapons in populated areas. It's a political process that we thought was sort of stagnating slightly until the Ukraine conflict, and thankfully the UK has outlined a position that it hopes to sign this political declaration in November, and one of the kind of messages that we're trying to promote is just to try and universalise that as widely as possible as a declaration that will henceforth stigmatise and politically govern how weapons are used in contexts where the vast majority of people impacted are civilians, are people who are never intended to be targets. And so that, I think that's one very practical thing that we and colleagues from the international community currently are trying to promote, to engage public and civil society, as I say, in an effort to get this declaration signed. There's something very tangible, we think, on the horizon that could come out of the horrendous experiences as our friends in Ukraine.
Doesn't it depend on who signs it then?
Yeah, it does. But we are seeing the US, indicate, and we're also seeing the UK. And if you get, as we've seen with the Mine Ban Treaty, until the Ukraine conflict, you have many states that become sort of it stigmatises the use of weaponry, and I think that's a starting point for IHL. So it's.
Don't we have everything that we need already in policy? The problem is that we have no way of enforcing it. Putin does what he wants. He breaks. All
He
the
doesn't
laws
care
he
about
commits.
stickiness.
It's not a.
Yeah, but I don't think it's a zero-sum game in that respect. I don't think we can. I don't think we can suddenly say, well, if you're going to be bad, we'll be bad. I think in that respect we've got to uphold IHL. And the more times it is weakened, the more precedent that creates, the less stigma it creates. And I think that is an approach that we would advocate for. Yeah, I agree with you that no, we're not going to see the usual suspects, sadly, get on board, but equally I think we would generate enough political pressure in some regard to be in a better position than we are. I think that's the pragmatic view of it. I agree.
Just going back to the demilitarisation of Russia, in the 1990s, Britain actually helped to there's a word for it, to relocate. It's when an officer retires from the army or a soldier retires, they're brought back into civilian life. We're very good at that with the British Army, and we did that in Russia, and 14,000 Russian officers were given a new life, and that's got to be part of it, hasn't it? You've got to think about when you're talking about demilitarisation, you've got to think about where that army goes and how you build society as well. It'd be quite interesting to see how that expertise could be carried on.
Well, there's plenty of room, to practice on violent problems. But I mean, it's realistic. Come on, the Soviet Union, when it dissolved, was the regaining of independence of all the countries. All our armies were cut. The Ukrainian army was cut significantly. Actually, one of the reasons why we were so weak, and that is the correct word in 2014, was because our army was literally being taken apart, both with the weapons being sold off to the rest of the world, as well as with the sort of demilitarization of the army personnel. The same was happening in Russia, so it's nothing new. But going back to your point about the rules work, the international rules work, IHL works. It's just one country which doesn't want to play by the rules. We shouldn't be all starting to break these rules or making up a new set just to accommodate that one country. These rules have kept us safe for the better part of the 20th century and part of the 21st century, almost 100 years they were working. I think my personal opinion is that Russia must be isolated until it has a government in place that is ready to bring it back into the rules-based society. At the moment, only the Council of Europe has kicked Russia out from its membership. The UN has failed to do so, although there is legal basis for never admitting Russia into the UN, because legally speaking, technically speaking, this is a very boring legal discussion. I'm not going to go into that, but technically speaking, Russia has zero credentials to be a member of the UN, let alone of the UN Security Council. And a lot of scholars know this has been picked up since the 90s in different legal papers. Other platforms include Interparliamentary Union. Next week in Rwanda and Kigali, there will be an assembly of 800 members of parliament from 178 countries in the world. And the Ukrainian delegation is expected to sit in the room with Russian MPs, members of the Russian Duma, who just a couple of days ago have voted to annex 4 regions of Ukraine. And the whole assembly will be listening to the likes of Tolstoy and Slutsky. These are 2 Russian members of parliament, very vocal on the Putin propaganda and on the supporting of the violence against Ukrainians. Nothing's being done there. So my solution is that Russia needs to be excluded until it learns to behave. And there shouldn't be any fear in thinking, that we're excluding them from the dialogue. What's the point of having a dialogue with a person who just tells you, no, la la la, I don't want to hear this, I'm doing whatever I want?
We even had this situation in the House of Commons, didn't we, where Russian diplomats were allowed to walk past the Queen's coffin. And that
Were they?
Oh, did you not know? Yes.
No, I didn't know that.
Yes. I think it was agreed that there wouldn't be anybody in Westminster Abbey, but yes, the speaker allowed them to, and yes, it was considered totally inappropriate because they were part of the diplomatic corps rather than the political. At the same time as how many MPs have been blacklisted in all sorts of...
Yeah, I've been blacklisted by Russia.
So, yeah.
Who knew?
We will,
Not China yet.
we will come to final reflections, but I can see two more questions. We have two quick questions, then we'll come to final reflections.
Yeah, sorry, it's just a follow-up to what you were saying about the Inter-Parliamentary Union. Has Ukraine been also engaging in relationships with individual African states, and are there more passive states on the situation that Susan has been made with?
Yes, so in short, yes, and actually our foreign affairs minister, since September, he has been on a round of visits to African countries. It is difficult, and it's not because of the African countries or the global south, for that matter, but the whole global south. It's because Ukraine has, to my very big disappointment and probably shame, not been doing enough to speak to the global south throughout the years of its independence. Again, to be fair, we were sort of always focused on east-west, so part of the population was saying, ooh, Russia, let's not stray too far away from those. Part was saying, we need the EU, we need NATO, US, and so on and so forth. So northwest was never really kind of considered as an option. But I think it's time to correct mistakes. The mistakes were made. The global south plays a huge role in global politics, and they cannot be disregarded. And the results, the consequences of this disregard are there. Russia has its influence. The West has less influence over the global south. Ukraine has less say in what's going on there. And well, we are where we are, and we have to make the best of it. And I hope that we manage to make the best of it, and to make sure that well, the African continent and Asia and Latin America see Russia for what it really is. And it's an empire. It's an empire with imperialistic aims and goals, and I don't think that that should be allowed to happen, and that empire should be allowed to come back and prosper.
Very quick one?
Not a quick one, so I'm going to skip it.
We can see that over there.
We're out of time. But I just want to, before we go quickly, thank our panel so much for their contributions today. I think it's been a fantastic discussion. So thank you very much for being here, and can we put our hands together for our panel?